The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as tourists from around the world gathered to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood 23-year-old Madison Wheeler from Beverly Hills, California. She wore designer sunglasses, carried a Louis Vuitton bag, and had the confidence that only comes from growing up with unlimited credit cards and zero consequences. Madison was in London as part of her post-graduation European tour, funded entirely by her father's tech fortune. She had already complained about the hotel's thread count, sent back 3 meals at Michelin-starred restaurants, and posted 17 Instagram stories about how everything in London was so old and boring compared to California. The Royal Guards stood at attention in their iconic red uniforms and towering bearskin hats. These weren't costume performers or actors. They were highly trained soldiers from elite regiments, men who had served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other dangerous places around the world. Each guard had earned his position through years of rigorous training and unwavering discipline. Guard James Morrison had been standing at his post for over an hour. At 28, he was a veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Grenadier Guards. His military record was spotless. His dedication, absolute. The bearskin hat he wore weighed nearly 2 pounds, and in the blazing heat, sweat dripped down his face, but he remained motionless as a statue. Madison pushed through the crowd with her phone out, recording everything for her social media followers. She had already made several loud comments about how weird the guards looked and how stupid it was that they couldn't move or talk. Her voice carried over the respectful whispers of other tourists, drawing annoyed glances from people trying to appreciate the solemn ceremony. "This is so lame," she announced to her phone camera, zooming in on Guard Morrison's face. "Look at this guy. He's like a robot or something. Watch this." She stepped closer to the rope barrier, ignoring the clear signs that warned visitors to keep their distance. What Madison didn't understand was that she was about to cross a line that would change everything. The Queen's Guard weren't just ceremonial figures. They were active soldiers with real authority to protect the royal grounds. And Guard Morrison, despite his stoic exterior, was watching her every move with the sharp eyes of a trained military professional. The other tourists began to sense something was wrong as Madison's behavior became more aggressive. Parents pulled their children closer, and several people started recording with their phones, though not for the reasons Madison expected. An elderly British gentleman in the crowd shook his head sadly, recognizing the signs of an ugly incident about to unfold. Madison's friends back home had always told her she could get away with anything because of her father's money and connections. She had never faced real consequences for her actions, never met anyone who wouldn't bend to her will when she flashed her credit card or mentioned her family's wealth. But she was about to learn that some things in life couldn't be bought and some people couldn't be intimidated. The crowd grew thicker as more people arrived for the ceremony, but an unusual tension filled the air. Seasoned tourists who had visited the castle before noticed something different in the guards' posture. They stood even straighter, their eyes more alert. It was as if they sensed trouble coming. Guard Morrison's training kicked in automatically. Years of military discipline had taught him to assess threats and respond appropriately. This young woman wasn't a physical danger, but she was clearly intent on causing disruption. His fellow guards, positioned at intervals around the courtyard, were also aware of the situation developing. Madison checked her phone and saw she was already getting likes and comments on her live stream. Her followers were encouraging her to do something crazy and make those guards break. The positive reinforcement from her online audience only fueled her determination to create content that would go viral. She had no idea that within the next few minutes, she would indeed become famous on the internet, but not in the way she hoped. The video that was about to be recorded would be shared millions of times, but the comments wouldn't be praising her boldness. Instead, she was about to become a cautionary tale about respect, consequences, and the difference between confidence and arrogance. The stage was set for a confrontation that would teach everyone present a valuable lesson about dignity, duty, and what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. Madison Wheeler was about to discover that there were still places in the world where money couldn't buy respect, and where acting entitled would only earn you exactly what you deserved. Madison stepped over the rope barrier, her phone still recording as she approached Guard Morrison. The crowd behind her gasped collectively, and several people called out warnings, but she ignored them completely. In her mind, this was all just part of the show, and surely these toy soldiers wouldn't actually do anything to someone like her. "Hey, statue man," she called out loudly, waving her hand inches from Morrison's face. "Can you hear me in there? Hello?" She laughed at her own behavior and turned back to her phone camera. "Look, guys, I'm totally messing with the Queen's guards. This is going to get so many views." Other tourists began pulling out their phones, but not to support Madison's antics. They sensed they were witnessing something that would have serious consequences, and they wanted to document what was really happening. An elderly woman from Scotland started shaking her head disapprovingly, while a group of school children on a field trip watched with wide eyes. Madison grew bolder when Guard Morrison didn't react to her initial taunts. She had successfully pushed boundaries her entire life without facing any real pushback, so she assumed this would be no different. She moved even closer, now standing directly in front of the guard, blocking his view and interfering with his duty. "This is ridiculous," she announced to her phone. "My dad pays more in taxes than this guy makes in a year, and he has to stand here like a decoration. It's 2024, people. This whole monarchy thing is so outdated." She turned back to Morrison and raised her voice even louder. "Don't you have anything better to do with your life?" What Madison didn't realize was that Guard Morrison had been monitoring the situation from the moment she first raised her voice. His training had taught him to give civilians every possible chance to correct their behavior before taking action. He had noted her initial disrespect, observed her crossing the barrier, and was now watching her directly interfere with his duties. The crowd had grown significantly, with people stopping their tours to witness what was becoming an increasingly uncomfortable scene. Tour guides were trying to move their groups away from the area, but many tourists remained, sensing they were about to see something extraordinary. Madison decided to escalate further. She reached into her designer bag and pulled out a $20 bill, waving it in front of Morrison's face. "Here, want a tip? Maybe you can buy yourself a real job with this." She actually tried to stuff the money into the guard's uniform, laughing hysterically at her own joke. That was the moment everything changed. In one swift, precise movement that demonstrated years of military training, Guard Morrison stepped forward. His voice boomed across the courtyard with the authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat zones. "Make way for the Queen's Guard." The sound was so powerful and unexpected that Madison literally jumped backward, stumbling over her own feet. Her phone flew out of her hand, clattering across the cobblestones. The crowd fell completely silent, and even the pigeons seemed to stop their constant cooing. Morrison continued his advance, his rifle held at the ready position, his face a mask of professional determination. This wasn't anger or personal offense. This was a trained soldier executing his duty to protect royal property and maintain order. His movements were precise, controlled, and absolutely intimidating. "Stand clear," he commanded again, his voice echoing off the ancient stone walls of the castle. Madison found herself face to face with a man who had risked his life for his country, who had earned every decoration on his uniform through service and sacrifice. For the first time in her privileged life, Madison Wheeler was truly scared. This wasn't like dealing with a store manager who could be swayed by her father's influence, or a restaurant server who needed her tip. This was a decorated military professional who answered to a higher authority than money or social status. She tried to stammer out something about being an American tourist, about her rights, about how this was all just a misunderstanding. But Morrison continued his advance, forcing her back toward the rope barrier with nothing more than his commanding presence and the weight of his authority. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Madison scrambled to retrieve her phone, her designer, sunglasses askew, her perfectly styled hair now disheveled. The confidence that had carried her through 23 years of getting her way had evaporated in seconds when confronted with real consequences. Other guards had now turned their attention to the situation, creating an imposing wall of red uniforms and unwavering discipline. Madison realized she was completely outmatched and outnumbered by people who took their duties seriously, and wouldn't be impressed by her family's wealth or her social media following. The transformation was remarkable. In less than 2 minutes, Madison had gone from a cocky, entitled tourist making content for her followers to a frightened young woman who suddenly understood she had made a terrible mistake. As Madison scrambled backward over the rope barrier, clutching her cracked phone with trembling hands, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. Dozens of other tourists had recorded the entire encounter, and she could see them already, uploading videos and typing frantically on their phones. This wasn't going to be the viral fame she had imagined. Castle security officers appeared within minutes, having been alerted by the guard signals. These weren't ceremonial figures either. They were professional security personnel trained to handle disruptions at one of Britain's most important historical sites. Madison tried to explain that it was all just harmless fun, but her voice came out shaky and unconvincing. "Miss, you need to come with us," said Security Supervisor David Chen, a former police officer who had dealt with countless disruptive tourists over the years. His tone was polite but firm, leaving no room for argument. Madison looked around desperately, hoping to find sympathy from other tourists, but she saw only disapproving faces and people actively avoiding eye contact with her. The walk to the security office felt like a death march. Madison's designer heels clicked loudly on the stone floors as she was escorted through areas of the castle that tourists normally never saw. Her mind raced as she tried to think of ways to minimize the situation, but for once in her life, her usual tactics of charm, intimidation, or bribery seemed completely useless. In the security office, Madison was presented with a formal incident report that detailed her violation of castle rules, harassment of on-duty military personnel, and disruption of a ceremonial event. The language was official and serious, using terms like breach of public order and interference with crown security. This wasn't a simple tourist mishap anymore. It was a documented legal matter. "I want to call my father," Madison demanded, finally finding her voice again. "He has connections. He knows people who can make this go away." She pulled out her phone, but when she tried to unlock it, she realized the screen was more damaged than she initially thought. Several large cracks ran across the display, and the touch sensors weren't responding properly. Supervisor Chen allowed her to use the office phone, and Madison dialed her father's private number with shaking fingers. Richard Wheeler was in the middle of a board meeting in San Francisco when his daughter's hysterical call came through. At first, he couldn't understand what she was saying through her tears and panicked rambling. "Slow down, Madison," he said, stepping out of the conference. "Aram, what exactly happened?" As his daughter explained the situation, Richard felt a sinking feeling in his chest. He had spent years cleaning up Madison's messes, but this was different. This involved foreign government property, military personnel, and international incident protocols. "Dad, you have to fix this," Madison pleaded. "Use your connections, call the embassy or something." But even Richard Wheeler, with all his wealth and influence in Silicon Valley, knew there were limits to what money and connections could accomplish, especially when dealing with century-old institutions like the British Crown. Meanwhile, the videos of Madison's encounter with Guard Morrison were spreading across social media like wildfire. The footage showed clearly how she had crossed barriers, harassed a military professional, and tried to bribe him with money. The internet's reaction was swift and brutal. Comments poured in from around the world. British users were particularly offended, explaining the significance of the Queen's Guard and the disrespect Madison had shown to military veterans. American commenters were embarrassed by how she had represented their country abroad. Military families and veterans expressed outrage at her treatment of a serving soldier. Within 3 hours, hashtags like Samina Respect the Guard and Entitled Tourist were trending globally. News outlets picked up the story, and Madison's full name was being shared across platforms. Her Instagram account, which she had been so proud of, became flooded with negative comments and criticism from people she had never met. The castle's public relations team issued a statement emphasizing the professionalism of their security personnel and the importance of visitor respect for historical sites and military traditions. They made it clear that such behavior would always result in immediate removal and potential legal consequences. Madison sat in the security office, still trying to process what had happened. Her European vacation, which was supposed to be a celebration of her college graduation, had become a nightmare. She couldn't understand how a simple attempt to create entertaining content had spiraled so completely out of control. Back in California, Richard Wheeler was already receiving calls from business associates who had seen the viral videos. The family's reputation, which he had spent decades building, was being damaged by his daughter's 5-minute encounter with a British soldier. He realized that no amount of money or influence could undo what had already been broadcast to millions of people worldwide. The immediate consequences were just the beginning. Madison was about to learn that actions have lasting effects, and that in the age of social media, a moment of poor judgment could follow someone for years. The real lesson was only starting to unfold. By the time Madison was released from castle security with a formal ban from all royal properties, the videos of her encounter had been viewed over 2 million times across various platforms. Multiple angles of the incident existed because so many tourists had recorded it, and each version told the same story. A privileged young woman disrespecting a military professional and facing immediate consequences. The hotel lobby felt different when Madison returned that evening. The staff, who had been politely accommodating before, now looked at her with barely concealed recognition and disapproval. The concierge who had helped arrange her tours that morning now avoided eye contact. She realized that her face had become internationally recognizable for all the wrong reasons. Her phone, despite its cracked screen, buzzed constantly with notifications. Her Instagram followers had indeed grown dramatically, but not in the way she had hoped. Instead of admiring fans, she now had thousands of people commenting on her posts with criticism, memes, and harsh judgments about her character and upbringing. Madison tried to control the narrative by posting her own video explaining what had happened, but her attempt at damage control only made things worse. In the video, she appeared defensive and continued to minimize her actions, saying she was just having fun and that people were overreacting to nothing. She even suggested that the guard had been unprofessional in his response. The internet's reaction to her explanation video was even more brutal than the original incident. Comment sections filled with military veterans sharing their own stories of service and sacrifice. British citizens explained the historical significance of the Queen's Guard and why Madison's behavior was so deeply offensive to their culture and traditions. News outlets began reaching out to her hotel, trying to get interviews. Madison declined all media requests, but that didn't stop reporters from digging deeper into her background. They discovered her social media history, which painted a picture of someone who had never faced real consequences for her actions and regularly displayed entitled behavior. Her father's tech company began receiving negative publicity as well. Business publications ran articles about corporate nepotism and privileged children of executives. Richard Wheeler watched helplessly as his company's stock price dropped slightly due to the negative association with his daughter's viral moment. The story reached international news networks, becoming a symbol of the broader conversation about entitled tourist behavior and cultural disrespect. Travel bloggers used Madison's incident as a teaching moment about proper behavior when visiting historical sites and foreign countries. Meanwhile, Guard James Morrison continued his duties with the same professionalism he had always shown. His commanding officers commended him for handling the situation appropriately, and his fellow guards expressed pride in how he had represented their regiment. The incident only reinforced his reputation as a disciplined and reliable soldier. The contrast between the two main figures in the story became stark. Morrison was praised for his restraint, professionalism, and dedication to duty. Madison became a cautionary tale about the dangers of social media culture and entitled behavior. The internet had clearly chosen its hero and villain. Madison's remaining travel plans became impossible to execute. Other tourists recognized her wherever she went, and she faced constant stares, whispers, and people attempting to take photos of her. Restaurant staff treated her with cold politeness, and tour guides seemed uncomfortable having her in their groups. She tried changing hotels, but the new staff had also seen the videos. She considered cutting her trip short, but flight changes were expensive, and she didn't want to give the appearance of running away from the situation. She was trapped in a foreign country where she had become infamous overnight. The psychological impact began to set in. Madison had always derived her self-worth from social media validation and the respect that came with her family's wealth. Now she was experiencing the opposite: public humiliation and widespread criticism from strangers around the world. For someone who had never faced real adversity, this level of negative attention was overwhelming. Her friends back home sent mixed messages. Some offered support, but others distanced themselves from the controversy. A few even made jokes about the incident, not understanding how deeply it was affecting her. Madison realized that many of her relationships were more superficial than she had believed. Sleep became difficult as her mind raced with anxiety about what would happen when she returned home. Would this follow her forever? Would potential employers see the videos? Would she ever be able to travel internationally without being recognized? These were questions she had never had to consider before. The viral storm continued to grow, with reaction videos, commentary pieces, and social media discussions keeping the story alive long after the original incident. Madison Wheeler had wanted internet fame, and she had certainly achieved it, but in the most devastating way possible. 3 days after the incident, Madison sat alone in her London hotel room, finally beginning to understand the true magnitude of what had happened. The initial shock and defiance had worn off, replaced by a crushing realization that her actions had consequences she never could have imagined. The constant notifications on her phone had become too overwhelming, so she had turned it off completely for the first time in years. Without the distraction of social media, Madison was forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about herself. She began to remember other times when she had been dismissive or rude to service workers, security guards, and other people she had considered beneath her notice. The pattern of entitled behavior that had led to this moment hadn't started at Windsor Castle. It had been building throughout her entire life. Her father arrived in London 2 days early, cutting short important business meetings to deal with. The crisis. When Richard Wheeler walked into his daughter's hotel room, he found her looking smaller and more vulnerable than he had ever seen her. The confident, demanding young woman who had always gotten her way was gone, replaced by someone who was genuinely frightened about her future. "Dad, I don't understand how everything went so wrong," Madison said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just trying to make a funny video. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." For the first time, Richard heard genuine remorse in his daughter's voice, rather than the manipulative apologies she usually offered when trying to escape consequences. Richard sat down heavily in the hotel room chair, looking older than his years. He had spent decades building his fortune and reputation, but watching his daughter's public humiliation had forced him to examine his own role in creating this situation. He realized that by always fixing Madison's problems and shielding her from consequences, he had never allowed her to develop genuine empathy or understanding of how her actions affected others. "Madison," he said carefully, "this isn't just about the video anymore. This is about who you've become and, frankly, who I've allowed you to become." His words hit harder than any criticism from strangers online because she knew he was right. Her father had never spoken to her with such disappointment before. They spent hours talking, really talking, for the first time in years. Richard shared stories about his own struggles growing up in a working-class family, how he had learned the value of hard work and respect for others through necessity rather than choice. Madison began to understand that her privileged upbringing, while comfortable, had left her unprepared for the real world where actions have consequences and respect must be earned. Meanwhile, the story had taken an interesting turn in the media. Several military veterans and British citizens had begun sharing their own perspectives on social media, not to pile on Madison, but to explain why her behavior had been so hurtful. They shared stories about the dedication required to become a Queen's Guard, the sacrifices these soldiers made, and the proud tradition she had mocked. One particularly powerful post came from the mother of a fallen soldier who had served in the same regiment as Guard Morrison. She wrote about watching her son train for years to earn his place in the Queen's Guard, and how proud he had been of the honor. Her words weren't angry or vindictive, but they painted a picture of the deeper, meaning behind the ceremony that Madison had disrupted. These stories began to shift the conversation slightly. While Madison's behavior was still widely criticized, some people started discussing the broader issues of cultural education and helping young people understand the significance of the places they visit. Travel bloggers and educators began creating content about respectful tourism and the importance of understanding local customs and traditions. Madison read these posts with growing shame and understanding. She realized that Guard Morrison wasn't just a statue man or a tourist attraction. He was a real person with a distinguished military career who deserved respect, not mockery. The uniform he wore represented years of training, sacrifice, and service to his country. For the first time, she tried to imagine what the experience must have been like from his perspective. Standing at attention for hours in heavy uniform and equipment, serving his country with dignity and pride, only to be mocked and harassed by someone who saw him as entertainment rather than as a human being doing his job. The guilt was overwhelming, but it was also transformative. Madison began to understand that her actions hadn't just been harmless fun, they had been genuinely disrespectful and hurtful. She started to see how her privileged background had blinded her to the experiences and feelings of people she considered different from herself. She asked her father to help her find a way to make amends, not for the sake of her reputation, but because she genuinely wanted to apologize for her behavior. Richard was surprised by his daughter's sincerity, but agreed to help her explore options for making things right. This marked the beginning of a real change in Madison's character, though she was only beginning to understand how much work lay ahead of her. The viral incident had stripped away all her defenses and forced her to confront who she really was, and more importantly, who she wanted to become. 6 months after the Windsor Castle incident, Madison Wheeler stood in a very different place, both literally and figuratively. She was volunteering at a veteran support center in Los Angeles, helping organize care packages for deployed soldiers overseas. The young woman who had once mocked a military professional was now spending her days learning about the sacrifices made by service members and their families. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate. When Madison returned to California, she found that the viral videos had followed her home. Friends at her country club made jokes about her famous moment, not realizing how deeply the experience had affected her. Some seemed disappointed that she wasn't laughing along with them about her newfound notoriety. Madison made the difficult decision to delete most of her social media accounts and step away from the lifestyle that had defined her for so long. Instead of posting about expensive restaurants and designer purchases, she began reading about military history, British culture, and the traditions she had so thoughtlessly mocked. Her father, inspired by his daughter's genuine desire to change, established a scholarship program for children of military families. But more importantly, he began setting real boundaries with Madison, requiring her to earn her own money and take responsibility for her choices. It was a difficult adjustment for both of them, but it marked the beginning of a healthier relationship. The most challenging moment came when Madison decided to write a formal apology letter to Guard James Morrison. She spent weeks crafting it, wanting to express genuine remorse without making excuses for her behavior. She researched his military background and learned about his service in Afghanistan, which made her previous actions seem even more shameful. Through official channels, the letter reached Morrison, who was surprised by its sincerity and depth. Unlike her initial social media response, this apology showed real understanding of why her behavior had been wrong and what his service meant. He appreciated the gesture, though he maintained his professional distance as appropriate for a serving soldier. Madison also wrote to the castle administration, expressing her remorse and asking if there was any way she could contribute to educational programs about respecting historical sites and military traditions. To her surprise, they eventually invited her to participate in a documentary about tourist behavior and cultural awareness. In the documentary, Madison spoke honestly about her privileged background and how it had blinded her to other people's experiences. She didn't try to excuse her behavior, but instead used her story as a cautionary tale about the importance of humility and respect when traveling. The documentary became a valuable educational tool, shown to tour groups and in travel preparation courses. The work at the Veterans Center opened Madison's eyes to stories of real heroism and sacrifice. She met families who had lost loved ones in service, soldiers dealing with injuries and trauma, and young people who had chosen military service as a path to serve something greater than themselves. These experiences gave her a completely new perspective on what true strength and honor looked like. 1 year after the incident, Madison enrolled in a master's program in international relations, focusing on cultural diplomacy and cross-cultural understanding. Her professors were initially skeptical of her motivations, knowing her background, but her dedication to learning and her unique perspective on the consequences of cultural insensitivity proved valuable to class discussions. She began speaking at high schools and colleges about responsible social media use and the importance of cultural respect when traveling. Her talks were powerful because she could speak from personal experience about how quickly a moment of poor judgment could have lasting consequences. Students related to her story and took her warnings seriously. The internet largely moved on to new viral moments and scandals, but Madison never forgot the lesson she had learned. She carried with her a deep understanding of how privilege could blind someone to the experiences of others, and how important it was to approach unfamiliar cultures with humility and respect. Guard Morrison continued his distinguished military career, eventually being promoted and taking on training responsibilities for new recruits. He occasionally used Madison's incident as a teaching example about maintaining professionalism under pressure, though he always emphasized that the real lesson was about treating all people with dignity and respect. The story that began with a spoiled young woman seeking viral fame ended with a transformed individual who understood that true respect must be earned through actions, not demanded through wealth or status. Madison's journey from entitled tourist to cultural advocate proved that even the most public failures could become opportunities for genuine growth and positive change. Her relationship with her father also evolved into something healthier and more genuine. Richard learned to see his daughter as a capable adult, rather than someone who needed constant protection from consequences. Madison learned to value his guidance while taking responsibility for her own choices and actions. The viral moment that had seemed like the end of her world became the beginning of a more meaningful life, one built on genuine understanding and respect for others rather than the shallow validation of social media fame.